The year 1346, the fields of northern France. One afternoon that would forever change the course of human warfare. Thousands of knights, their armor gleaming in the late summer sun, mounted on powerful war horses, riding with absolute confidence in their invincibility. These were the elite warriors of medieval Europe, men who had trained their entire lives for this moment. But within just a few hours, everything they believed in would be shattered. Simple men, commoners wielding wooden bows, would reduce Europe's most feared and respected warriors to broken corpses in the mud. This is the story of the Battle of Crécy, the day when English archers proved in one devastating afternoon that the age of the knight was coming to an end. But this isn't merely a tale of military tactics or a single battle. This is the story of an entire world order collapsing, of centuries-old certainties crumbling, of the medieval world giving way to something new and terrifying. To understand what happened at Crécy, we must first understand what a knight truly was in 14th century Europe. Being a knight wasn't simply a profession or a role in battle. It was an entire identity, a social class, a way of life that had existed for generations. A boy born into nobility would begin his training as young as 7 years old, serving as a page in another noble's household. By 14, he would become a squire, learning the arts of war, how to ride, how to fight with sword and lance, how to move in armor that could weigh 60 pounds or more. This training was extraordinarily expensive. A full suit of plate armor cost more than a village could earn in years. A properly trained war horse, a destrier, could cost as much as a small estate. Weapons, maintenance, servants, equipment, creating a single knight required an investment that only the wealthy could afford. And this expense created a system. Knights were nobles because only nobles could afford to be knights. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of power and privilege. On the battlefield, this investment seemed justified. A fully armored knight on horseback was a devastating weapon. The weight of horse and rider, the protection of steel plate, the reach of a lance, infantry simply couldn't stand against a cavalry charge. When hundreds of knights charged in formation, the thunder of hooves shaking the earth, it was psychologically and physically overwhelming. Battles were decided by knights. The common foot soldiers were support, nothing more. France possessed the finest knights in all of Christendom. For generations, French nobility had refined the art of mounted combat into something approaching perfection. Their armor was the best crafted, their horses the most carefully bred and trained, their tactics tested over countless battles. French knights had fought in the Crusades, in dynastic wars, in tournaments and melees. They were professionals in the truest sense, and they knew they were the best. But while France perfected the old ways of war, England was developing something different. English kings, perhaps recognizing they couldn't match France in numbers of heavy cavalry, had invested heavily in a weapon most of continental Europe dismissed as beneath the dignity of warfare: the longbow. The English longbow was a remarkable weapon. Standing 6 feet tall, crafted from yew wood, carefully selected and seasoned, it required immense strength to draw. The draw weight could exceed 100 pounds. To put that in perspective, most modern bows have a draw weight of 40 to 50 pounds. Pulling a longbow required developing specific muscles, creating actual skeletal changes in the archer's body. Skeletons of medieval longbowmen show enlarged left arms and distinctive bone growths from the repetitive stress. And England had created a culture of archery. By law, every able-bodied man was required to practice with the longbow regularly. Sunday afternoons after church were devoted to archery practice. Boys began learning as children, their bodies adapting to the weapon as they grew. This wasn't just military preparation, it was a national identity. England was creating thousands upon thousands of expert archers, men who could shoot 12 arrows per minute accurately at ranges exceeding 200 yards. A skilled longbowman could pierce chainmail at 100 yards. Arrows could penetrate plate armor at close range, especially at the joints and gaps where armor plates met. But more importantly, longbows could kill horses. And a knight on foot, weighed down by 60 pounds of armor, was just a slow-moving target. Yet to the French military establishment, none of this mattered. Archers were peasants, low-born commoners. The idea that such men could stand against noble knights seemed absurd, almost almost offensive to the natural order of things. In 1346, King Edward III of England invaded France with an army of perhaps 12,000 men. Among them were roughly 7,000 to 8,000 longbowmen. He also had perhaps 2,000 men-at-arms, knights and heavier infantry, along with various Welsh spearmen and other troops. It was a significant force, but when French King Philip VI gathered his army to respond, he commanded perhaps 30,000 men, including over 12,000 of the finest knights in Europe. The French pursued Edward's army as it moved through northern France. Edward, recognizing he couldn't outrun the larger French force, chose to make a stand. On August 26th, near the village of Crécy, he selected his battlefield carefully, a gentle slope with his forces at the top, flanked by forests and a river, with a nearby windmill serving as his command post. Edward's tactical dispositions were brilliant. He divided his men-at-arms into 3 battles or divisions, positioning them in the center and slightly back from the crest of the slope. Many of these knights he ordered to dismount and fight on foot, a decision that shocked contemporary observers, but which made perfect tactical sense. Between and on the flanks of these divisions, he placed his archers in V-shaped formations called harrows, pointing forward toward the enemy. This meant any French force attacking up the slope would face arrow fire from multiple angles simultaneously. When the French army arrived in the late afternoon, their commanders could see the English position clearly. The proper tactical response would have been to wait, to rest the men who had been marching all day, to attack fresh in the morning with a coordinated plan. But the French nobles were eager for glory, convinced of their superiority, and unwilling to let mere commoners dictate the terms of battle. Philip tried to order a halt, but the momentum of his massive army and the eagerness of his knights made control impossible. The French did make one concession to proper tactics. They had hired 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, professional mercenaries considered among the best missile troops in Europe. The plan was for these crossbowmen to advance first, suppress the English archers with their own fire, and then the knights would charge into a disrupted enemy line. But everything went wrong from the start. The Genoese had marched throughout the day and were exhausted. A brief rainstorm had wet their crossbow strings, reducing their weapons' power, while the English archers had simply unstrung their bows and kept the strings dry under their helmets. Worse still, the Genoese had left their large protective shields, called pavises, with the baggage train far to the rear. They were advancing without proper equipment against fresh, prepared enemies in a strong defensive position. When the Genoese came within range and began to shoot, the English response was devastating. Thousands of archers, each capable of shooting 12 arrows per minute, released simultaneously. The sky literally darkened. Contemporary chronicles struggle to describe it. They speak of the arrows blotting out the sun, of looking like dense black snow, of a continuous roar as tens of thousands of arrows filled the air. The Genoese, unprotected, were slaughtered. Within minutes, they were fleeing back down the slope, and here the French made a catastrophic mistake. The knights, seeing the Genoese retreat, viewed it as cowardice, as hired foreigners failing in the moment of truth. Rather than helping their own troops or allowing them to withdraw safely, French knights began riding down the Genoese, trampling them, cutting them down for blocking their path to glory. The battlefield descended into chaos. Fleeing Genoese, enraged French knights pushing forward, and all the while that continuous devastating rain of arrows falling from above. And still, the French knights charged. Wave after wave of France's finest nobility rode up that slope into the teeth of the English position. It was slaughter on a scale rarely seen in medieval warfare. The arrows struck horses first, and war horses, no matter how trained, cannot maintain formation when wounded. They reared, they bolted, they fell screaming. Knights were thrown to the ground, and in 60 pounds of armor, standing up was nearly impossible without help. Those knights who kept their mounts and continued forward found the arrows striking with lethal precision. English archers weren't aiming at the strongest parts of the armor. They targeted gaps, the visor slits in helmets, the joints at shoulders and elbows, the gaps at the armpit behind the knee. An arrow through the visor would kill instantly. An arrow in the knee would bring down both horse and rider, and still they charged. 15, perhaps 16 separate cavalry charges the French made that afternoon, each time hoping their valor and numbers would overwhelm the English position. Each time they were driven back by that merciless arrow storm. Bodies began to pile up at the base of the slope. Dead horses and dead men created obstacles that the next wave had to navigate, slowing them further, making them even easier targets. The few French knights who did break through the arrow fire and reach the English men-at-arms found themselves fighting dismounted, exhausted, often wounded, against fresh troops in prepared positions. They were cut down methodically. By the time darkness finally ended the battle, the scope of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Somewhere between 1,500 and 4,000 French knights and nobles lay dead on that field. The records vary, but even the lowest estimates represent catastrophic losses. Among the dead were some of the greatest names in French nobility: the King of Bohemia, blind but insisting on being led into battle, where he was killed; the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Flanders, the Count of Alençon, the flower of French chivalry, an entire generation of noble warriors destroyed in a single afternoon. English losses were minimal. Some estimates suggest fewer than 200 dead, though exact numbers are uncertain. What is certain is the disparity was shocking, unprecedented, almost unbelievable. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Knights were the masters of warfare, the warrior elite, protected by the finest armor money could buy, trained from childhood in the arts of war. They weren't supposed to be defeated by peasants with wooden bows, but they were. Crécy shattered fundamental assumptions about warfare and society. It proved that common men, properly equipped and positioned, could destroy noble knights. It demonstrated that new technology and tactics could overcome traditional martial superiority. It showed that the future belonged not to individual warrior prowess, but to coordinated, disciplined use of effective weapons. Yet remarkably, the lesson wasn't learned, not immediately. France, traumatized and humiliated, convinced itself that Crécy was an anomaly, a result of bad luck and poor leadership rather than a fundamental shift in military reality. 69 years later, at Agincourt in 1415, French knights charged English archers again, and again they were slaughtered in almost identical fashion. Even seeing it twice, the lesson remained unlearned by those whose entire identity depended on denying it. But history moved on regardless of what individuals believed. The age of the mounted knight as the dominant force in warfare was ending. Crécy marked the beginning of that end. In the following centuries, pike formations, crossbows, longbows, and eventually gunpowder weapons would make armored cavalry increasingly obsolete. The feudal system that knights represented would give way to centralized nation-states with professional armies. The military dominance of the nobility would fade, and with it, much of their political power. One afternoon, one slope in northern France, a few hours of arrows falling like black rain, and the medieval world began to die. The English longbowmen at Crécy didn't just win a battle, they killed an entire way of life. They proved that the age of the knight was over. In one devastating, blood-soaked afternoon, they made knights useless forever.